Okay, before we begin, I just want to say that I am once again changing how my reviews are handled. Not the flow of my reviews, but rather the setup of said review. See, initially, the batch review idea worked out well for me since I could stockpile games before reviewing them. But after a while, that method started to fail me a bit since I'd find myself completing a game in the batch and then getting caught up with dual queue stuff for a month or two before posting here again. Not to mention work and life stuff that happens. So, after talking with a friend of mine, you know who you are, I thought I'd try doing, well, both. Any game I play that is either on the shorter side or doesn't really get a lot from me to talk about is going to end up in a batch review. That doesn't mean they're bad. That just means that I don't have much to say and I'd rather not drag that out for a 10-minute video, you know? But anything that gives me a lot to talk about ends up as its own video. Besides, I'd hate for Resident Evil 9, for example, to end up in a batch review where I only spend 3 to 5 minutes talking about it. Wouldn't you? Hopefully this is the last time in a while that I'd feel the need to change things to this extent. But without further ado, let's talk about the good life.
Yeah, baby!
So, here's the thing. This is a tricky game to talk about, let alone recommend. I'm just going to tell you from the gate, this is a sweary game, meaning it's quirky and weird by default. I mean, that is exactly what he and White Owls Incorporated set out to do with their games. That's their mantra for game design. Be weird. Do things that are different than everything else. Or to quote him directly, we're working day and night to create completely unique things that no one's ever seen before. And to quote him later on, referring to the name White Owls, in ancient Greece, owls were called sages of the forest and thought to be servants of Athena, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. Their eyes can pierce the darkness, their ears can hear sound in 3D, their wings allow them to silently catch their prey, and their claws can effortlessly tear through even the toughest of bodies. There is also an albino species of owl clad in sheer white feathers, which possesses an especially mystical quality. We at White Owls hope to keep growing until we can someday evolve into a similar type of mystical entity. We've only barely taken our first breath, but we hope you'll keep an eye on us as we embark on our journey.
Wow.
So you know, at the heart of it, in their game design, that's what they stand by. They're doing this weird shit on purpose. And normally, I love them for that. I mean, this is the same studio that gave us Deadly Premonition and The Missing, so if you've played either of those games, you know exactly what I'm getting at. So either way, let's get into the nitty-gritty of it. From this review forward, I'll be providing blurbs of the story, of any game for that matter, from here on out like I used to, and still occasionally do, but it hasn't been very consistent. In The Good Life, you play as Naomi Hayward, a photographer from New York sent to this
Goddamn hellhole.
Called Rainy Woods to figure out why it's apparently the happiest place on earth. And honestly, between you and me, I'd be suspicious of any town, regardless of where it is, with that kind of moniker attached to it, so I don't blame journalists and the like for wanting to jump on that kind of story. Visually, The Good Life has a lot of charm to it, until you look into the distance. I enjoy the style, artistically speaking, of it a lot, but honestly, I think I would have preferred if it stuck to a more open area design than an open world one. Kinda like the likes of Yakuza did. Yakuza is just my go-to example for that kind of thing, because I think they do it particularly well. I'm mostly saying that because besides the main town, the main little town of Rainy Woods, and a couple of other places on the map, there really isn't much out there for you to explore unless you want to pee on everything, I guess. I'll get to that later. That wasn't a joke. I really mean it. You are pissing on things at some point. There are pros and cons to the open world style of the game, obviously. It helps immerse you and gives you other places besides Rainy Woods to go. That's a positive. You can find other wildlife and gather other goods, and that's fine. But the cons for me outweigh the pros. The environment, for a lack of a better word, is drab. And that wouldn't be so bad if traversing the open world on foot didn't take so long. You know, if you didn't have fast travel points unlocked. There are a few points of interest, but other than that, I hope you like the color green because that's most of what you'll see. Now, I don't mind grass plains. I don't mind the way that the environment is portrayed. What bothers me is that there's very little to really differentiate different spots of the world. Like, you can have a mine there, and there are like 3 mines, arguably, in the game, and then nothing but grass for a while. Some hills, but grass, and then a stone wall. There's nothing to really differentiate the patches of grass. There's not many flowers around. It's very flat, and that's the problem I have with it. If it was more lush and whatnot, you don't need a bunch of flowers all over the place, just something to make the environment more interesting. Then that would have been fine. But unfortunately, the environment is just plain flat. And this is how I felt about the likes of Deadly Premonition as well. If I wanted to compare the titles, I normally don't like doing that because I like to take each game for what it is, but I'm just going to pull Deadly Premonition in here for a moment and say that, again, this is how I felt about that game, but at least you had a car in Deadly Premonition, and York would occasionally talk to himself while driving, giving you something else to focus on, because while the environments can be drab sometimes in games, whatever the player is talking about or whatever the player is doing might be more interesting or might add to the environment. Final Fantasy 15 had a very boring open world, but I didn't really care nearly as much because there was something else to focus on while I was wandering around. Be it combat or driving in the car with the bros, some banter that goes on occasionally ambiently. That would have been nice. And I'm not saying that this game had to follow the same graphical trends and all that, like, oh, Darryl, White Owls is a small company and that other game's from Square Enix. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about providing something more while the player's walking around. If Naomi talked to herself or gave some bits out loud of information that I could just grab onto and be like, oh, that's interesting to know about her, or that's interesting to know about her last job, or something like that, it would have helped make those sections when I'm moving from one point to another with no fast travel in sight less boring, and I would have been fine with that. But all in all, that doesn't take away from the fact that the environment looks the way it does. Heck, there's rarely any music in the game either until you entered certain areas or certain parts of town and whatnot. And yes, you do get a mount eventually later.
Yeah, baby! Yeah, baby! Yeah, baby! Yeah, baby! Yeah, baby!
But that's much later in the game. Like, you're approaching endgame by that point. So most of the time you're traveling in silence. Another point I'd like to make, visually speaking, on the UI side of things this time is that the game has a number of lines that are spoken in cinematics that are not reflected in the dialogue boxes. And on top of that, there are some typos here and there too, and normally more forgiving of that, but it was very noticeable this time around. And I even found some debug string text in one of the shops that I can then I can reliably get to come up again and again and again, and it's kind of obnoxious. But if I had to continue the good vibes of the good life, thank you, I'm here all the time, literally, then I would say at the very least that the game's style is unique and kind of relaxing to look at. It's very comfortable, at least in the early parts of the game. I'm not going to get into the story, but once you hit the story, that's when you don't get as comfy. I'll put it that way. As for the character designs, they range from adorable to what are you and why are you? And honestly, in that regard, I wouldn't have it any other way. The cast of characters are fantastic and have their own distinct personality. I mean, if you're going to play a Swery game, then you must know that the gameplay is often weird or niche, but the characters are often weirder. With the exception being with the missing, as most of those characters are very grounded and stuff like that, with the exception of one. It's often a selling point for me with these kinds of games, so I'm happy to say that a lot of the cast is delightful and painfully annoying. Inspiration strikes! Sorry, I don't know where that came from. Now, for spoiler's sake, I'm only going to talk about our protagonist, Naomi Hayward.
Ah! Don't they have pest control around here? You got any idea how much these sunglasses cost? Goddamn hellhole. What?
She's a stuck-up, money-grubbing, pain-in-the-ass bitch. I'm just gonna put it bluntly. That's what she is, and I love her for that. She only cares about money and the best ways to get money via a hot scoop because she needs to pay her comically large and unreasonable debt. Which in that case, I guess anybody will be money grubby when you have to pay that much money and you're that deep in debt. So I don't necessarily blame her, but it doesn't change how I feel about her as a character. Now, she has her moments when she cares and shows heart, but that's often brushed aside the moment she starts hearing that she can make at least $5 doing something. She'll be like, I'll take it. And the thing is, that's not a criticism. Again, I said I love that about her, because some of my favorite protagonists are the ones that are assholes. They're just the most entertaining to watch. Like, don't get me wrong, I love a protagonist with a good heart. I love my Spider-Man types. But you know what? Sometimes I need a little venom in my life. I'm just saying. Just saying. Or the best of both worlds, which is typically Deadpool for me. Just saying. Is it obvious I'm a Marvel fan? If it's not, I can keep going. No! With all of that said, let's get to the gameplay. Because gameplay-wise, The Good Life is a life sim. So expect to be taking care of Naomi's health, hunger, having her shower, do beauty care, etc. And that part's pretty cool, honestly. A lot of it is a simple button press at the place you need to be at, but it's still pretty cool to do. Beyond that, you're not doing much else besides taking pictures and participating in very clunky combat. And I mean very clunky. You think Deadly Premonition was clunky, this takes the cake. The photography was cool. I liked that as one of the mechanics because you can change out the lenses, buy new ones for better shots and this and the other. And I liked being able to interact with the town. And by that I mean just about every single building there you can go into, with the exception of some houses and whatnot. But the businesses, you can go in. It's not just window dressing, you can go in and shop, which I think is really cool. You can even change Naomi's attire if you really want to, and give her a bigger backpack so she can carry more stuff. There's also points in the game, and I'm going to go ahead and say this now since it's on the cover of the game and stuff like that. You can turn into a cat, and you can eventually turn into a dog. A lot of the cat gameplay is mostly based around agility and whatnot, so you can use the cat form for jumping onto roofs to collect things and whatnot. And for the dog, you can use that for a while until you get the mount, for being able to run around faster and longer, because as Naomi put it, she only goes to the gym every 3 months, so she doesn't run very far or fast herself. And to make good on the promise I made earlier, yes, in the dog form, you can indeed pee on things. There's also a gauge on the HUD that sways either towards the cat side or towards the dog side, and that's completely dependent on which forms you tend to prioritize, if I remember correctly, and which shrines you tend to pray to, because there's a lot of story reasons for that. I'm not going to go into it. And which villagers you decide to help, because those villagers also turn into a cat or a dog. And this can affect game prices, like things in stores. If you help out someone who's a dog and you keep helping out people in the dog, I'm going to call them the dog clan, then eventually the prices and reputation with those people get better. So you can get stuff for cheap because you're cool with the big dogs. That said, with everything I've said about the gameplay, because I didn't go into much deeper detail about those things, but with all that said, I still feel like this game would have benefited greater from going full sandbox and diving deeper into each mechanic they present. Because as it stands, there isn't enough depth here to anything you're doing to make it engaging. And normally that would be okay for a sweary game, since you really only play sweary games for the cast of characters and the off-the-wall story. At least that's why I do it. And that is certainly a highlight here. But unfortunately, this story just wasn't it for me. And I guess that's just the price you pay when you're making games like this that are very unique, or you're setting out to do something very unique. Not every game that you make, regardless of your status, regardless of who you are, is going to click with people who like your games because you're designing them in a way that is very unique. So while I may be a fan of the sweary games I've played thus far, it was only a matter of time that I was going to come up to one that I'm just like, about, I guess. I like The Good Life, conceptually speaking, but as a game, it just isn't my cup of tea. There are parts of it that is, but you can like different ingredients that make up the tea, but not the whole drink itself sometimes. And that's unfortunately the case here. And with it being a sweary game, that's doubly so for people who aren't even familiar with these games. So it might seem harsh, but I guess it's only natural that a sweary game would be the first game on my channel to get this kind of score. But I'm gonna have to give The Good Life an avoid at its general price of $30. But I can give it a caution at best if you have Game Pass. I do think it's worth trying if you have Game Pass, but I wouldn't tell you to spend $30 on this. I've played worse games and definitely have moments where I've enjoyed myself in this game, but that stuff was primarily in the story. And even then, it was just the wacky moments. Things get dry very quickly by the midpoint of the game, and it's then when you realize that there really isn't much to this game. Deadly Premonition gave me both fun gameplay and a story that was totally up my alley. The Missing was also very good from a gameplay and narrative standpoint. I'd go so far as to say it was fantastic, but The Good Life misses the mark on both ends for me. If you were interested in this game for the sake of the fact that it's a sweary game, then I'll have to say you might want to look elsewhere. If you've played it and loved it, then that's great, and power to you. I don't want to make it seem like my opinion on the game in this review is something that's completely objective and you can't possibly like this. No. If you loved it, then feel free to say so in the comments. If you think I've totally missed the point of the game, then say so in the comments. If you think it's unfair that I'm sitting here and talking about Sweary's previous works and comparing them to this one and the precedents he set, then again, let me know. I'm completely fine with that. And if you're dead set on playing this yourself anyway, regardless of the price, then by all means, go for it. It's available on the Switch, PC, PS4, and Xbox One for $30. It's also on Game Pass, and honestly, that's the only way I'd recommend the game to you. For free. And that does it for that review. So, the next game I intend to review, I don't want to say this as if it's locked in and set in stone, but the next game on my mind that I want to play through for this channel is Alyssa. Or Elisa. I don't know how to say the name out loud. Whether or not Elisa shows up as its own separate review, or if I just include it in a batch if I don't have much to say about it, then we'll see. Until then, I hope you guys have enjoyed your stay. I'm TUSDarryl. See you guys later.